and welcome to Reclamation, an NWM initiative. I am Naomi, and today I am sharing part 1 of 2 of Nicole's story. You'll hear a bit about our history together in the interview itself, so I won't share about our connection right now. I do want to say, though, that this conversation haunted me for a while after recording it, and it continues to haunt me every time I think about it. Nicole's bold narrative is a deeply powerful testament to the tragedy that comes from false teaching. Sometimes, as is the case for Nicole, the losses cause irreparable harm. Thank you for joining us in this important work of preventing future stories such as this one and providing a voice to those who are healing. During this interview, the interviewee shared her personal story. NWM is not in any position to verify the accuracy of any allegations made, and therefore neither endorses nor embraces opinions of its guests as its own. Our goal is to provide the platform for personal stories to be shared in the hopes that they may help others. Please note that all of our episodes can be difficult to listen to and potentially triggering in different ways. Listener discretion is advised. How are you feeling?
Nervous.
I know you keep saying you're a writer and you're not a speaker, so,
right.
But you don't have to be a speaker for this.
Yeah,
you really don't.
I just feel like sometimes, like I said, I rabbit trail, and sometimes I don't say things as eloquently as I can write them. So I'm usually the one on the interview side. So it's a little interesting for me.
Well, to help, I will, in the episode notes, I'll link your websites, and then people can go there and read your writing as well.
Okay.
I know you brought up starting with how we know each other. And do you want to give your side of that first?
How we know each other?
Yeah.
Well, I don't know. I was just sitting in a pew at church, and you came up to me in the dark.
I don't remember it being dark.
It was dark because...
That sounds creepy. I do remember kind of like coming up. Didn't I like kneel down next to you or something?
Yeah,
or
after
like
the
squat down?
my testimony. And it was like darker.
Yeah.
And it was weird because I was actually really disappointed with my testimony and how it was presented, because I think the main point got really missed and edited out, which obviously I want to share my testimony to help others, but also feeling like your voice was silenced for so long, and feeling like you finally have an opportunity to, say your piece, and then having it kind of stripped away from you again. Right. It was actually really hard. So it was really interesting when you came up and you're just like, I know you and your story, but I don't. And just the fact that you took the time, and it kind of did make me feel a little more heard, of like notice of not just, oh my gosh, there's this sad story of this girl losing her husband, but I think from the get-go you picked up on the deeper side of it. From probably your experience, you could probably pick it up more than other people, and that's kind of the healing that I needed more of. The spiritual healing, as opposed to just losing my husband.
Yeah.
Because I was so confused, and I couldn't find anybody to really point me in the right direction, because nobody really knew what to do with it. Because it felt so not normal.
Yeah, and that is a story that I have an overlap with. I'm going to offer a couple clarifications for any listeners first. So you had recorded a testimony at a church that I had also been attending at the time, and a huge church though. So it's not like highly unlikely we would have just run into each other. And this was shown then at a women's conference, and we both were at that women's conference. And the testimony was played, up on the big screens and stuff. So I believe it was also, I didn't know what you looked like. I saw you then, I think, either get up and go to the restroom or something, and I saw you and knew, okay, this is the same person, but I knew your name. And so, and I definitely knew your story, as far as what you were sharing, at least the basics of it. So the background to that is, and it was a little sketchy for me because I'm like, I don't know if I can introduce myself. Like, I had to think about that from an ethical standpoint.
Right.
Because I was a social worker, not your social worker, of course, but I was a social worker at the hospice that your family was involved with. And so behind the scenes, I was hearing the team updates about what was going on with you and your husband and your pregnancy and your children. And didn't you have a cat that needed a home?
Yeah.
I remember the cat.
Oh my gosh, that cat. If I didn't have 30 kids waking me up, then this stupid cat wanted to get out. In the middle of the night, wake me up. I was like, I can't do this, cat. I'm sorry, I love you, but...
Yeah, and I think one of the nurses took that, and I was like, well, should we take the cat? But, because I love cats, we were, it's possible I could have had your silly cat. You would have been seeing your cat right now.
Yeah. I hope she's okay.
So, if she went to who I think she did, she has a lovely life. So I was hearing about your story, and I was very drawn to what I was hearing. As in, I wanted, it was hard not to be a part of it with your family. It was hard not to be on the team with you. So again, I was just behind the scenes hearing about it and offering support to the team because the team was very impacted by they were emotional about what was going on and struggling with how do they provide support and what does that look like in particularly difficult circumstances. I'll put it that way. I know we're going to get more into it. And a lot of this that we're going to talk about wasn't really known, I don't think, correct? Like the spiritual side, a lot of that, maybe some of it, but...
I don't know the conversations that he had with his social worker or the nurse because we were pretty separated at that time. So if he had said something along the lines of like his spirituality or anything like that, or his faith in God or something, I wouldn't have known. And it wasn't brought up to me because I was never really... I think I was just kind of lumped together and like, oh, if this is what he wants, then everybody wants this. So we'll just kind of tiptoe around it.
Okay. So the part that resonates with me that you've already spoken to a little bit is that complicated grief component, which when this episode drops on Reclamation, we will have already dropped a deeper dive conversation with Amber Myers, who is an LCSW, on complicated grief. So for anyone listening, I'll link that in the notes for people to go back and check out. But I think it's a significant overlap that you and I both have struggled with. Nobody does know what to do with complicated grief that has this type of complication. There are lots of people who are incredibly versed in complicated grief as a whole, but complicated grief with a cult attachment where the spirituality is warped and causes a lot of issues and confusion, that's a really tough area. And I could not, to be totally upfront, I could not find support for that. I found some general grief support. I remember doing something very therapeutic actually where an art therapist covered a wall with brown paper and I got to just like throw paint all over the place. That was actually like very therapeutic for me. But as far as talking it out and really supporting me, no one really knew how to do that.
The only thing that helped me was not talk therapy. I and they say, you have to test drive counselors because they're not all great or they all don't know what to do with you.
They're not all a great fit. Yeah.
I mean, I'm sure they're great for other people, but they weren't great for me. And the reason why talk therapy wasn't great for me is because I had PTSD on top of complicated grief. So no matter how much talking I did, my brain couldn't piece together what happened. And so the turning point for me was EMDR therapy in letting my own mind process something that I wasn't allowed to process when it was happening. And EMDR is not talk therapy. It really is. And it sounded kind of like, ooh, a little hokey at first when you kind of read about it, but it really did, like, it changed the course for me in my healing when I was allowed that space, because I wasn't allowed that space for so long. People didn't understand what was going on, and I didn't understand what was going on in my mind and my body and why I was continually impacted and like triggered by stuff. So yeah.
EMDR is incredibly, it's so cool. I just think it's such a cool intervention, and it's one I've almost had a couple of times. Talk therapy ended up working for me. Typically someone will try that route before they would refer, and so that's how it happened with me. And I'm like, no, this is good enough. There's a part of me that's like, but I just want to do it, you guys, because it's really cool, and I just feel like it's gonna help even more. And my husband Michael actually had EMDR early on in our marriage for some triggers that he had going on, and he couldn't really pinpoint how to put it all together, and it was incredibly effective. So basically it's you're using eye movements to help the brain reconnect and process, but in a very safe and kind of controlled environment as well.
Yeah, it's very fascinating.
It's so interesting. Yeah. I'm going to back us up. So we've covered kind of how we connect, and I think we've given a lot of teasers. We've kind of alluded to a lot. So I want to back us up and fill in some of these blanks for people, kind of like, what are we sort of talking around right now?
Sure.
What is the name of the unhealthy group that you were involved with?
So when I had met my future husband at the time, he had said that he was kind of like a Bible scholar. He went through lots of classes. He kind of eased into it a little bit because in his past he had, I think, scared women off with his intensity about the Bible and his like passion and stuff. And when I had come onto the scene, I had come from, growing up in, I guess, a traditional church, non-denominational background, but also having a lot of poor experiences with and letdowns, I think, with church in general, because I was such a deep thinker. And I had all these questions that nobody could really answer. And so I was very frustrated and kind of lost. And so when I came onto the scene in his life, I was seeking answers that nobody could seem to answer for me. And I wanted to seek God, but I didn't know how, because nobody actually told me that I could have a relationship with Jesus Christ, or it was a personal thing. It felt so far, God felt so far away. And so when he started talking and answering my questions, I was like so simply, I was like, what is this? And so he kind of eased into it and was saying, well, there's this really great minister named Dr. Werewolf, and he was from, 50s, 60s, 70s movement called the Way Corps International. And he discovered these mysteries in the Bible that really nobody else has really discovered before. And, he said, my parents were in the Way Corps. I grew up in the Way Corps. And then I've taken all the classes. I've read all the books. Here's this book, Power for Abundant Living. You have to read this. And he was super genuine and super excited. And that's one thing that really drew me to him, was his passion about and his love for God. and his knowledge. Like, he could point out the Greek translation and the comma shouldn't be here, and this actually means this, and look, and in the, he, and all these different very complicated things he just made seem super easy to understand. And so I was very drawn with that, because I was a very lost person, but also really, really wanting to find my faith. So he had invited me to a Bible study, a quote unquote, not a Bible study, it was like the foundational class of Power for Abundant Living, which is something that Dr. Werewolf started in the Way. And it was kind of this intro to the more deeper classes that were offered later in the Way core before Dr. Werewolf died. So in this intro class, it was held in his pastor's basement, because home fellowships were church. Like, church wasn't brick and mortar. It wasn't a place. It was the body. Like, wherever 3 or more are gathered, that's where church is. And so he's like, you have to take this class to understand the mysteries of it. And so I meet this pastor, and this wasn't we are the way. It was an unsaid thing that this is where we came from the Way, but we splintered off. This is our own thing. We're not a part of the Way anymore because Dr. Werewolf died. The Way core as it is now is not what a lot of the original Way people wanted to associate with, I think. So they made branch fellowships and things like that. Okay. So this is what I entered into this basement class. Okay. I guess.
So there's overlap with the Way, but it's not it's a splinter group where it's not 100% the same doctrine.
Right. I think a lot of the foundational things are the same, and obviously using the books and the classes, and I had to pay for the book and all these things. So yeah, that's kind of how I got introduced to the whole thing.
I'm going to ask one kind of technical question that I'm pretty sure I know the answer to, but I just would want to point out, because I think it's something important for people to think about. Typically, the nature of splinter groups, the leaders end up without any oversight because they're not actually a part of like this bigger picture anymore. Do you know if this gentleman, and I don't want to say a name or anything, but do you know if this gentleman had any oversight, or was he really just kind of running this thing by himself?
Yeah, it was just a soul thing that he had. He was just this pastor of this home fellowship. Yeah. And, but all of the older believers is what we were like, everyone was a believer who like kind of went to this home fellowship. Directly were tied with the original Way, with Dr. Werewolf as the front leader or the overseer of the whole thing.
Okay. I want to move into, I want you to share what happened with you and Phil and your family, if you don't mind sharing that, because I think, first of all, it's pivotal in your story, and I think it will give the context for how the spiritual side complicated things. But before we do that, will you share what was your relationship then with the spiritual group? Did you full on own it and you're like, I'm a part of this too? Were you like, no, I don't think this is for me? And what did that look like for you personally?
So, like I had mentioned before, the Way, just with Phil and I's personal conversations, when we would do our own Bible studies, I felt so at ease. I felt really impressed by his knowledge because clearly he had studied a lot. And, but when I could almost sense, I feel like one of my gifts that God has given me that has helped me a lot my whole life has been discernment and like just feeling out situations. And I always say like getting that pit in your stomach is a pretty big red flag for me. So walking into that basement the first time, I felt that pit. But I also was interested in Phil. I was also interested in learning more because what I had learned up until then wasn't working for me. Like church wasn't working, like as a whole.
Yeah.
But I wanted God. I didn't want church. And this was something completely different. And so that's kind of what the curiosity kept me there, but also my attachment to Phil.
I mean, the guy played the guitar and could sing.
Yeah.
You didn't have a
I'm
shot.
A sucker.
You didn't have a shot.
Yeah. I'm a sucker for the musicians. But yes, that's how we met at an open mic night, but I digress. But yeah, stepping into that basement, I actually invited my mom because I wanted to be like, look, I found this like Christian guy finally, you know, come to this Bible study. Like that's what it was presented to me as. This is this Bible study. And so she was excited because she wanted to do something with me because she had thought, you know, she was upset for a long time thinking that like I had lost my way. And so she was excited too. So she sat through these, I can't remember how long the Power for Abundant Living class is, but I'm sure you can look it up. Like 4 weeks, 6 weeks, I don't know. So every one day a week, we'd all meet in this basement and talk about the mysteries that no other churches know about that are clearly and plainly pointed out in the Bible. And so this pastor kind of led us through looking at these passages and what regular church teaches versus what the truth is, and it was always correct interpretation. The Bible says what it says, nothing else. You can't change it. You can't interpret it the way you want to interpret it. It is what it is in its original text in Greek or Aramaic or Hebrew or whatever. Like in the original text, you can't change it. And so that's kind of what kept the driving point of, look, this whole verse changes if you move the comma. This comma wasn't originally here. Now it reads completely different. And so a bunch of different things like that. I'm like, oh, wow. So the intellectual in me is like, wow, that's fascinating.
Well, and if I may jump in, what I'm curious about now is, I mean, you just gave a definition for exegesis, like how to properly read the Bible, and then how to interpret it based on what the author was saying at the time to the audience at the time. So knowing that cultural difference and being able to take that meaning, and then we know how to apply it to today because we know what it's actually saying. Because in our culture, something can look very different than, for example, the culture 2,000 years ago,
like Orientalisms.
Yes, totally.
Yeah.
So I couldn't disagree completely with what you just explained. And I think that's important to point out because I wouldn't want anyone who's listening to think, oh, so it's bad to do that. It's not. What's interesting is what they then did or what they claimed they then did that they didn't really do.
Right. Which is why this is so hard for me to even be here because I see a lot of truth, but you can have a lot of truth, but if there's one bad apple, it can kind of taint the whole thing.
Yes.
If that makes any sense.
Yeah, I had someone, I think she just made it I think she said it in just such an understandable way. Let me know if you agree with this. She's like, you get a truth, and then they slip in a lie. And there's a truth, and then they slip in a lie. And there's enough truth that the lie, even if like you kind of go, huh, that seems off or that seems odd, when you take it all as a whole, you're like, oh, this is all generally right and good though. And it's just so much easier to kind of let it roll off your back and keep going. Because there are some things that you or I could walk into where you'd be like, this is so radically wrong.
Yeah.
And other things where you've got to work a lot harder.
Yeah. Yeah.
To
And
catch
so
it.
how it was presented was like, yeah, it's right here. It's in my, I can see it for myself in this Bible. That is what this says. And, how to, look at concordances and how to, compare the different translations. And so, like I said, the intellectual part of me was like, I can make this make sense, which is what humans want to do in life, is make things make sense. And there's a lot of things about God that doesn't make sense. So I was like, yeah, this is amazing. Like, I have never had a pastor ever explain any of this to me, but with some key differences of like, there is not a Trinity. Jesus is not God. The Bible, I was told, clearly stated Jesus is not God. That the mystery is Christ in us, which means not only salvation, but that we can do everything Christ did. We can heal people, we can prophesy, we can teach, we can, like, all the gifts of the Spirit was huge. And that we had a power for abundant living, and that's what God wanted for us. That we were meant to be whole and healed here on this earth as believers, as long as we have Christ in us. And so the end of the class and a part of the mystery of Christ in us is also speaking in tongues, which I don't disagree with. The Bible talks a lot about that. Paul talks a lot about it. However, it was presented, the only way you can know for sure that Christ is in you is if you can speak in tongues. And so it's interesting because up until that point, my mom was on board. And when he started, okay, we're all going to like start practicing speaking in tongues together. I've never not had anybody do it. And she got up and left. And I was stuck between, do I go follow my mom? Because clearly she's upset. Do I be like, oh, well, I got to follow this through, And so I did, but I was really upset because I was like, why do I have to make this so public? This is really uncomfortable. I felt upset. I started crying because I was like, I don't want to really do this. Like, this is not, I want to make a choice to do this. And I feel really forced to do this. And so they brought me in his office and was like, you can do this, and like coaching me to like speak in tongues. And so like I finally did. And I mean, I didn't see like stars in the heavens didn't open up, and I didn't change into this new being or anything like that. It wasn't like that. And that's not what I was promised either. But I was like, okay, well, that was weird. Cause so it was just under the guise of like, okay, all of these things in the Bible says this. So this, whatever has been going on up until this point, what I was exposed to in church, like maybe it was all wrong. Maybe I wasn't saved. Maybe this is so uncomfortable because, any uncomfort or any negative thoughts was immediately like, it's the devil. So it's like, well, I don't want to question what's true, because I don't want to give in to that. And Phil knows so much and is so passionate about this. Like, and I was so drawn into it because of him and my attachment to him. Right. The whole interesting, ironic part about the whole thing, that as believers, we can have a powerful, abundant life now, like here on earth right now, which means if we pray and request and we expect wealth, if we pray and request and expect health, success, no fear, all the negative things, like we can just kind of shed off because we are like new men and women in Christ. Like we have so the ironic part about the whole thing is that in his early 20s, Phil was diagnosed with lung cancer. Before I met him, he had gotten his one lung removed. And when we started dating, I had asked him, so, how's that going? Right. And he had never gone back to the doctor because he's like, well, I'm just healed. I'm just believing I'm healed. So whatever. And I'm like, I think maybe you should go to the doctor because like I said, with the feelings and all the kind of attachment, and I still felt super uneasy about this new doctrine, and I couldn't really put my finger on it. So I wasn't like gung-ho, yes, this is it. This is my life now. I'm like all in 100%. It was still like 1 foot in, 1 foot out. Like I didn't jump into the pool.
Yeah.
I was kind of hanging out on the edge and observing, because that's how I am. I'm an observer. And so that's the ironic part, that I finally talked him into going to the doctor. He sat me down after the doctor's appointment and he said, it's back. There's 7 tumors in my remaining lung. And I could see in him the struggle between wanting to be real with me, because at least he was honest and didn't just say, oh, whatever, I'm healed. So I think that made it more complicated, because here's a person who grew up hearing, you have Christ in you, you can heal yourself. Or if people lay hands on you, you can be healed and all these miracles can happen. And yet he went through surgery to remove his lung. He went through chemo. He, by himself, mostly, like, I don't think a lot of his friends were even really aware what was going on, because he didn't want people to fuss over it. So here I come and I'm like, I don't know what it was or why, but I just said, I guess we better get married. Because I was trying, it was kind of joking. Because he never said, I'm stage 4, I'm terminal, I'm going to die. That was never a conversation. But it was kind of an unspoken thing, I think, between us, that neither of us were even brave enough to talk about. We got married like 2 months later, and he was told he would never have kids because of all the chemo and stuff. And I got pregnant with twins. And then I got pregnant with my 3rd child 2 years after the twins. So, I mean, I see, despite all of the confusing doctrine that we were like clinging to, God still made his true presence known. Like, he didn't abandon us. He didn't like punish us for not knowing everything. Or maybe believing skewed things. Or I think Phil grew up believing all these things and being told all these things, that it was just a natural thing for him to do. Like, he didn't question, like, he was told he was going to be healed. And so if you don't talk about it and you don't confess it, then there wasn't anything to talk about. So we didn't talk about it. And he did. But again, that's the confusing part, because yes, he still went to get scans. We didn't just completely ignore it.
How long had it been ignored between his first surgery and then you encouraging him to go back? Because I'm assuming he was in remission.
No.
In between. He hadn't been?
He was never declared.
Got it. Okay. So he had but then he just
finished his surgery and just didn't go back.
Okay. Do you know how much time had gone in between?
I'm not 100% sure. Maybe a couple years, a year.
Okay.
I don't know.
And it sounds like because of, and this would be typical, it makes sense logically with the beliefs of the group, that no one else is encouraging him to do anything other than claim his healing.
Right. I mean, I believe that he went to a couple of really close friends and to tell them that, hey, the cancer came back. And they're like, oh, no, it didn't. Hey, man, just confess, just believe positively. It's not back. You're healed. Don't give in to that. And so, again, me sitting on the edge of this pool, looking inwards, things, just red flags started blaring in my face. And, when we moved and I started seeing his like extensive collection of like Dr. Werewolf books and really looking at them. And I'm like, and there was these books written about this guy who is ironically dead, who told everybody, we're meant to live forever, and he died, like, I think in his 60s or 70s of, ironically, cancer that nobody knew about, because nobody wanted to say it. like how your leader who tells you all these things dies. And so that's strange. These people were putting Dr. Werewolf on this pedestal, like he was this great man of God, and it just kept saying his name more than God. And I'm like, wait a minute, why are people putting their faith in this person who, one, is dead, and two, is not God and is not Jesus? And so I started pointing these things out, and we kind of butt heads a little bit, but I did see Phil kind of the wheels turning and being like, wait a minute, this is probably not adding up. And so I could kind of see the struggle with him too.
So when you were getting towards the end of Phil's life, what was the dynamic and the belief at that time? As you're seeing his decline, were you believing that he would be healed, or were you believing that, no, they're wrong and I'm going to lose him?
I didn't want to acknowledge that they're wrong, I'm going to lose him. I think that some of what was going on wasn't like doctrinal misguidance. I think a lot of it was also denial. I mean, I was 28 and he was 34, and we had just started our marriage. We weren't even married 4 years. And so I did everything I could. Like I went to nutrition classes. I got all the supplements. I was trying to cure him. I was trying to support him. He had told me, do not say anything negative about my health. If people ask, be positive. So that's what I was told to say. That's what I was told to email people. People didn't know how bad it was. I was by myself in that. I was always torn between how I really felt and how I should be feeling. So waking up in the middle of the night, making sure he's still breathing, and then feeling super guilty that I just believed wrongly for him. And that if I believe wrongly for him, then maybe it's my fault that he's not getting better. But I couldn't help but be scared. But then I had to put on a brave face with everybody else because I was trying to honor his wishes. It was his life. It was his illness. What am I supposed to do? I was trying to be his wife and support him. The only time, and I think that a lot of even the professionals, medical professionals, wanted to treat us with satin gloves and not be real with me or him. Because it was just such a sad story. Here I am pregnant with our third child, and he's undergoing intensive chemo treatments to try to slow down the massive growths in his lungs. The only time that a doctor was real with us was in September when he went into the hospital for he had a panic attack and a breathing attack because he couldn't breathe. And she was this European doctor, and she just point blank, you are going to die in 6 weeks or less. What are your plans? And that was the first time we had ever heard anything like that, ever. I couldn't wrap my head around that because our daughter was supposed to be born in 7 weeks. So we both kind of teamed together. We're no, God told me, God told me I would live to see my kids. I'm going to be healed. And I'm okay. And so he stopped treatment. And this is where it's just confusing for me because yes, we wanted healing, but we also did do medical intervention. We did enter hospice. We did ask for help. So it's hard for me to explain our reasoning.
And I'm trying to think if I can help you explain it because to me, you're making sense. This makes sense to me. I have this semi-related moment of calling my brother. I had gone to visit some friends for New Year's Eve, and my mom had been staying with my dad. This was out of state. She had not been in New York with us. She had been in Ohio with him for at least a couple of months, and I had kept hearing he's fine. And I showed up to see him, and he was very much not fine. I actually saw him for the first time in several months on a Tuesday, and he died that Sunday. So that's how not fine he was. He was in his active dying phase already. And I had still been told the previous week he was fine. And I saw him and was really wrestling with myself. And the way I ended up telling my brother that he should come see our dad, I still remember this. And I definitely had dissociated at the time because I can see myself making this phone call. I called him and said, for all intents and purposes, based on what it looks like logically and from an American worldview, for all intents and purposes, Dad is dying and he's going to die soon. I think you should come. I couldn't actually say I believed he was dying because I still couldn't receive that. I still believed that something, I believed it so strongly, Nicole, that I left Saturday night and went home. And he died at noon on Sunday. That's how much I believed it. But yet, I told my brother he should come. Kind of like just in case. You know, it's this
your
weird,
logical part.
Yes. Yes. Yeah. So again, I don't know that that's helpful in explaining it for someone, but shock can put anyone into that kind of in-between place anyway. So maybe that term is more helpful. In more normal day-to-day terms, like a state of shock where it's like my reality and my belief system are not aligning and I don't know what to do with that. So I'm kind of living in reality, but I still have my belief system. And so it's like this ongoing out-of-body experience where I never really know if I even fully agree with what I'm doing or not.
Right. Yeah, that's perfect. Because it's hard to explain, because it's like I almost feel like I have to justify, like, I wasn't stupid, I wasn't crazy, I was 28, I had never been around death, I had never had to deal with hospice, I had never had to deal with anything. We were newlyweds and new parents. Like it was like way over my head. And then adding all the spiritual pressure. At that point, I really do feel like I had dissociated from myself, and I was just supporting him and doing what he wanted. It was not about me. Like any of my needs went out the window.
Once hospice came in, did that shift anything for you?
No, it made it worse because I was separated. So I still remember.
And let me clarify this. I'm not sure if I said that clearly, so let me just clarify quickly in case. Did it shift anything belief-wise for you?
No.
Okay.
I was letting him take the lead, and I still remember the relief I felt, but also the guilt I felt for feeling relief when he was in the bathtub, and I was still pregnant at the time. And he called me in and he said, I don't think this is going to go very well. And he started crying and he said, I don't understand why this isn't working. I speak in tongues. I have Christ in me. I am requesting and claiming that I'm healing. Why isn't this working? And that was the first time I'd ever seen him allow himself to be real for a second. And I was like, oh my gosh, like he's saying these things finally, like, can we be real now? You know? And I was like, we need to tell your family, because he had not allowed me to say anything to anybody. And I said, you need to tell your family. And so he did. He called. He's like, we need help, you know. And what we got back was, we're believing for your healing. We'll come out and help after the baby's born. We're praying for you. So when somebody's actively dying, which was not explained to me by the professionals at all, I had no idea what an active dying process looked like. I didn't know that the hallucinations and the confusion and the panic and the paranoia and the mood swings and all the things, I had no idea. So I was dealing with that by myself. I had 2 2-year-olds, and I was pregnant, and I was also trying to figure out and try to remember how I'm supposed to dose this morphine to this person who's screaming at me saying that the morphine's possessed and it has the devil in it and I need to throw it in the trash because he's not going to take it. And so I'm at a loss. I don't know what to do, and I don't have any help besides my mom, who came to help put the twins to bed because I couldn't lift them up anymore by myself. I remember the only time that I was free to say what I needed was when I went to my last midwife appointment by myself. And I'm sitting there in this, the gown and all the things. And I had enough courage or exhaustion, one or the two, to I just broke down and I told the midwife everything. And the boys, my twins were born in 15 minutes. So I said, I don't want to have this baby by myself in the kitchen. He can't, I was just by myself. My husband couldn't get up and go on late night ice cream runs if I had cravings, or drive me to the hospital when I had contractions or anything. I was just by myself. And so I told her I didn't want to have the baby by myself. And so she was the only person that I was honest with, because I said, my husband's dying. And then I felt guilty for saying it. But that was the only time I had to... It was the only time I could speak up for myself, because I wasn't around anybody else. It was just me. I didn't have to put on a brave face or be strong. And so she jumped into action. She's we're going to pick a date for you to be induced because of how quick you had your boys. It very well could be possible that you could have a kitchen floor baby. So we'll just here's this date, make it to this date. Mm-hmm. This is your goal. And I felt so much better. At least they knew the situation. I felt this weight off my shoulders. I felt somebody heard me, somebody realized maybe how crazy this was. And he had one foot in the grave 2 weeks before our daughter was born. I was fully preparing because I, at that point, could not sleep in bed with him because of the oxygen machines, because he was up all night with panic attacks and nightmares and insomnia, and I had to sleep. I had to hold it together for the twins and myself, so I was sleeping on the couch by myself. So every morning I woke up and I was fully prepared to open that door, and he wouldn't be there. But he was, and so the morning that I was going to go to the hospital, he's I just can't go. He was so concerned with the fact that he couldn't carry his oxygen with him to the hospital. And I'm well, we're going to a hospital that has oxygen in the wall. Mm-hmm. You're fine. But he couldn't wrap his head. He was so confused. Right. And so my dad dropped me off at the hospital, and there I was again alone with this baby. Okay, I'm going to have this baby by myself. My mom had to watch the twins. Mm-hmm. And I called Phil, and it was and the nurses were amazing. They reserved a whole room for him, mm-hmm. and a hospital bed in the maternity ward for him. Mm-hmm. And I called him. I said, they have a whole room. You can hook your oxygen right into the wall. And so that convinced him to come. So the nurses, would wheel him back and forth between my room, and then he would go rest and all the things. And I'm getting to a point here with our spirituality is when I finally had our daughter, and he was there, and that's what he said. God told him that he would live to see his daughter. And I had never seen him with so much energy after she was born. He got up from his wheelchair. He followed her around, taking pictures. He was so proud of her. He was so excited. He took pictures of her, getting her first bath and getting all the things, And then I remember, they pushed our hospital beds up next to each other. So, I could sleep next to him, which hadn't happened for months. But he, again, he took off his oxygen. He's this baby, it healed me. And so he's, ringing the nurses more than me. Hey, check my oxygen levels. Like, am I better? He was like trying to convince himself. Because I think he wanted to be there for us. So I was a little annoyed with him, kind of, because I'm like, dude, I just had a baby and you're getting more attention than me. And so, I'm like, I just need to sleep. So he was sitting and he's like, I gotta write this down. And it was funny because I had signed a thing to go get my tubes tied. Mm-hmm. And they're like, all right, let's go do it. And he's like, what? Because I honestly didn't talk to him about it because I was like, I'm not going to bother him with that. I don't want any more kids, And he's like, we are going to have like 5 more kids.
Oh, good heavens.
And I'm like, okay. And I was like, okay. And the nurse looks at me and I'm like, whatever. I don't even care. I was like, whatever he says. I just went along with it. Yeah. But he spent all night. He never... he could never say that he was dying. He never could say that he was like in his last of days. And I begged him to write letters to the kids. And he never would. He said no. Because that was like his admission, I guess, if he did something like that. I think it was way too hard for him. But what he did do and what he could do was that night in the hospital, while I was sleeping, and I didn't know this, but he went around and tracked down every nurse and doctor who was like involved to write a letter to his daughter about her birth. And that's what he could do. And I found that little folder, later. I mean, he showed it to me later. I was like, what is this? And he just told me what he did. And that was his way of being there for her. But he never quite could forgive him that he never wrote any letters to his kids. But I do understand, also.
Right. That's a hard reality to accept for anyone, let alone additionally. I'm an outside perspective, so I do not say this by any means to be dismissive of how you feel. I would be upset about that too when I think about my son. I struggle not to place the blame where I think it belongs, which is the teachers of the false theology that put him and your family in a position to not be present in what was really happening. And that presence would have allowed your family to have maximized the time in a way that you were unable to, in a way that was taken from you.
Yeah. And that's that's how I describe it, is when I brought that baby home, it all hit the fan and our end of days or whatever together were stolen from this belief system. And it didn't get amplified until I brought that baby home. And his family came in, and I was this postpartum wreck, sleeping in the living room with a newborn, trying to heal. But everyone seemed to have forgotten that I had just had a baby. And I wasn't supposed to be running after twins, and I wasn't supposed to be up and carrying loads of, all these things. I was not a concern. I wasn't even a concern for myself. I had overheard a conversation because I was upset. I had just had a baby. I had no help. My mom tried, but she had only done so much. And when his family came in, she's like, okay, I'm relieved. I gotta, take some rest, but I still overheard a conversation of one of his family members going like, I don't understand why Nicole's so upset. Why is she crying all the time? My mom's like, do you not see what's going on? It was like there was a disconnect. It was a disconnect of, like I said, there's a fine line between hope and denial. And we were all walking that line real close. And at that point, I was in survival mode, and I was like, I gotta keep this baby alive. I gotta keep myself alive. I gotta keep Phil alive, and I gotta keep these toddlers alive. I don't really care what the heck else goes on. So I had no personal space. I was sleeping in our living room. There was people all around, nurses, social workers, his pastor who would come in, tell him, you don't have to be in hospice. You don't have to take these meds. Have these Bible studies with him in his room while the door was shut on me. And I had no personal space, no understanding of what was going on between his family and these pastors or whoever coming in. Thank God Phil did agree a little bit before things got really bad, really early on in my pregnancy. He agreed to go to a brick and mortar church because quite honestly, they had childcare and we could actually focus on the sermon. And they were a huge support. They were complete strangers who completely, I had more support from strangers than the people who were the closest to our situation.
Thank you for listening to this production of Naomi Wright Ministries. You can learn more about us by visiting naomiwrightministries.com. Please note that any opinions represented by this ministry are not to be mistaken as medical or professional counseling advice or services. Employees, volunteers, representatives, guests of Naomi Wright Ministries may be individually trained, authorized, or licensed to provide professional counseling, psychological treatment, or psychological diagnoses. What you are listening to or viewing is not the provision of any such services. None of the interviews represented here creates a counselor-counselee relationship.